Hi, this is Paul Hamilton. We're going to talk about today a question I get asked all the time. How much sport pilot time can be used for the private pilot certificate? The answer is yes, you can use sport pilot time for the private pilot certificate, but it gets a little complicated. We're going to go over all those details. The first thing is what we're going to do is we're going to look at exactly how the private pilot time is broken out. Now, as you probably know, basically, for private pilot, it takes 40 hours of flight time. For sport pilot, it's 20 hours. Now, of that private pilot hours, we've got 20 hours of dual by an authorized instructor. This is where it gets a little tricky. 10 hours of solo. And since the total is 40 hours, you've got 10 hours of anything. So we're going to talk about the 10 hours of anything first because that's the simplest. This 10 hours, this can be anything. This can be your solo time as a student pilot, solo time as a sport pilot. This could be training in a helicopter. This could be training at a weight shift control. It's just legally logged flight time. So this can be anything. So this is kind of a wild card. So yeah, so anything can count towards this. Now we get to our 10 hours of solo. So solo, 10 hours of solo. Now solo. It doesn't really matter if it's sport pilot or private pilot. Your 10 hours of solo is good. Now, the whole thing is that there's details about this 10 hours of solo. Instead of you just believing everything somebody says on a video or on the internet or a rumor or a myth you're told, we're going to go right into the regulations so that you can describe this to somebody else rather than it just be something you heard. So we're going to head off into our regulations and look at that. Now, of course, when we go to our regulations, we've got our FAR AIM book here. We go to 61-109. This is where we have all our details about our private pilot certificate. Now, we can look in our paper book. We can go on our digital people. You can go in and look at that. We're going to go actually into the digital and look at it right there. Okay, now digitally, what I do is I always go into the FAA official ECFRs. This is your electronic code of federal regulations. Is updated daily. So we're going to go in here. We're going to go to part 61. And we're going to go down here, part 61 to private pilots 109 aeronautical experience. Now we've got private pilot aeronautical experience. For an airplane single engine rating, except as provided in paragraph K of this section, a person who applies for a private pilot certificate in the airplane category and single engine class rating must log at least 40 hours of flight time that includes at least 20 hours of flight training from an authorized instructor, and we'll go over that, and 10 hours of solo flight training in the areas of operation listed in 16107B1 of this part. That's all your maneuvers. Okay, so here we get to our 10 hours of solo flight time in a single engine airplane. This is the root of what we're going to talk about right here. We've got 5 hours of solo cross-country time. Okay, of this 10 hours of solo time in a single engine, we've got to have 5 hours of solo cross-country time. Now notice one solo cross-country flight of at least 150 nautical miles in total distance with full non-stop landings get 3 points, and one segment of the flight consisting of a straight line distance more than 50 nautical miles. Now, notice that for the sport pilot, this is 75 nautical miles total and 25 nautical miles in a between takeoff and landing. So what we do if we know someone's going to be going for a private pilot, we just train them on this route and send them out on this route so they've got that done as a sport pilot. And it also counts towards a private pilot. Okay, and then for private pilot, of course, you need 3 takeoffs and 3 landings at a full stop involving flight in a traffic pattern. Okay, this is for your solo flight time here. Okay, and you can get that as a sport pilot also. Just to be clear on our cross country for solo, so we're going to go into part 61.1, applicability and definitions. So as we go down here, we're going to go down to what cross-country time is. Cross-country time means for the purpose of meeting aeronautical experience except for rotorcraft category for a private pilot certificate, a commercial pilot certificate, or an instrument certificate, or for the purpose of exercising recreational privileges, time acquired during a flight conducting an appropriate aircraft course, That includes a point of landing that is at least a straight line distance of more than 50 nautical miles from the original point of departure. Private pilot. And let's go down here a little bit more. We're going to see that for the purpose of meeting the aeronautical experience of a sport pilot certificate, time acquired during a flight conducted in an appropriate aircraft that includes a point of landing at least a straight line distance of more than 25 nautical miles. So we got 50 nautical miles for private, 25 nautical miles. So if you want to count your sport pilot time towards private pilot, you're going to have to do your point to point at 50 nautical miles to count as cross-country time. Okay, so there's our details here of our 10 hours of solo, your 10 hours of sport pilot training or sport pilot as a pilot flying. All that counts towards your 10 hours of solo to get that, but it has to meet the private pilot definitions that we've talked about. Now we get to the 20 hours of dual. Now this is where it gets a little bit tricky. Back when they first developed the rule, the FAA said that all your sport pilot training can count towards your private pilot. Well, when they wrote the rule, they put in the word authorized instructor. Well, that went to be questioned, and it turns out the authorized instructor does not mean a sport pilot instructor for your dual training. It has to be a private pilot instructor. So if you were trained as a sport pilot by a private pilot CFI, now your 20 hours of dual, all that time will count. If you were trained by a sport pilot instructor, this 20 hours of dual does not count, except for recently within the last year. We fought for this sport pilot hours to count towards a private, which finally after, since 2004, here it was 2019, they finally enacted that. And you can see here we got a 2020, and you can see how we got the black mark on the side here. So this whole new regulations was added to your 61109 for your private pilots. We're going to go ahead and read this specifically. 40 hours of flight time includes 20 hours of flight training from an authorized instructor. So if you're training for sport pilot and you're trained by an authorized instructor for private pilot, all that training counts. But for a sport pilot, it does not, unless we look at our new rule. So what we're going to do here is we're going to, 61109, we're going to go to the very end of this, of all the aeronautical experience. Now this is all for private pilot. See, we're going down through gyroplane, we're going through powered lift. We're going to go all the way to the end here, right before the night flying exceptions. Okay, this is brand new. In 2019, permitted credit for flight training received from a flight instructor with a sport pilot rating. The holder of a sport pilot certificate may credit flight training received from a flight instructor with a sport pilot rating towards the aeronautical experience requirements of the section. The following conditions are met. The flight training is accomplished in the same category and class of aircraft, obviously airplane. The flight instructor, the sport pilot, was authorized to provide the flight training. So whatever that sport pilot instructor is authorized to train in, he can do that. The flight training, including either training in areas of operation that are required for both the sport pilot certificate and the private pilot certificate. Okay, now, of course, almost all the areas, takeoffs, landings, stalls, on and on. Almost all the flight maneuvers are required for both the sport pilot. So all that stuff counts. For airplanes with a VSVH greater than 87 knots, training on the control and maneuver of an airplane solely by reference to flight instruments, including straight level flight, turns, descents, climbs, use of radio aids, and ATC directives, provided the training was received by a flight instructor with a sport pilot rating who holds an endorsement required by 61412C. 61412, this is where a sport pilot instructor can be trained and to actually provide instrument training for a sport pilot for their solo requirements. Okay, this brings us to another detail on this 61412. Now notice again, this is a new regulation because it's got the black line on here from 2019 upgrade to 2020. And it says, do I need additional training to provide instruction on control and maneuvering an airplane solely by reference to instruments in a light sport aircraft based on VSIVH? Okay, to provide the flight training under 6193E12 on control and maneuvering of an airplane solely by reference to flight instruments for the purpose of issuing a solo cross-country endorsement per 6193C1 to a student pilot seeking a sport pilot certificate. A flight instructor with a sport pilot rating must hold an endorsement required by 61327, which is above the VSIVH above 87 knots, receive and log a minimum of 1 hour of ground training and 3 hours of flight training from an authorized instructor in an airplane and with a VSIVH greater than 87 knots calibrated airspeed, or in a full flight simulator, flight training device, or aviation training device that replicates the airplane with a VSIVH greater than 87 knots calibrated airspeed, and receive a one-time endorsement in his or her logbook from an instructor authorized under subpart H of this part. In other words, a private pilot instructor who can provide instrument instruction of this part, who certifies the person is proficient in providing training on control and maneuvering solely by reference to the flight instruments in an airplane with a VSIVH greater than 87 knots. This flight training must include straight and level flight, turns, descents, climb, and use of radio navigation, ACT direct. So, in other words, this new regulation allows sport pilot instructors to receive some instrument training and provide that instrument training to sport pilots for their cross-country solo. Now, when we go in here, something that's missed by a lot of people under 6193C1. Let's go in and look at that. And we're going to go down until we get to E12. These are all the maneuvers required for solo cross-country. Control and maneuvering solely by reference to flight instruments, including straight and level flight, turns, descents, climb, use of radio aids and ATC directives for student pilots seeking a sport pilot certificate. The provisions of this paragraph only apply when receiving training for cross-country flight in an airplane that has a VSIVH greater than 87 knots calibrated airspeed. So, all airplane pilots flying cross-country need this endorsement. And of course, sport pilots only if the VSIVH is greater than 87 knots. Now that's for most of those aircraft. To get back here for our 20 hours of dual, so we're going to call that 20 hours of dual minus 3 is our first minus 3. Now that, again, if your sport pilot instructor got that extra instrument training, the training for solo, and for your 3 hours of private pilot instrument for the solo can be included in this 20 hours. So, in other words, this 3 hours of flight training in a single engine airplane on the control and maneuvering of an airplane solely by reference to instruments, this 3 hours can be done by the sport pilot instructor and included in the 20 hours if he's qualified. There has to be some instrument training done anyway for the solo. But if this is done by a sport pilot instructor, this 3 hours can be added into the private pilot. Now we've got one other minus 3 that cannot be added into this 20 hours of dual. That is for your private pilot 3 hours of training before the check ride. And here we're looking at aeronautical experience. We go down here and we can see our 3 hours of flight training by an authorized instructor in a single engine airplane in preparation for the practical test, which must have been performed within the preceding 2 calendar months from the month of the test. Okay. That 3 hours of training before the check ride, that can only be done by a private pilot instructor. So in reality here, we've really got 17 hours here that can really be applied because of this minus 3 of the 3 hours from your private pilot instructor for the private pilot check ride. In other words, the sport pilot instructor cannot provide that 3 hours of training needed for the private pilot check ride. So keep in mind, we're talking about minimum hours here. It's usually going to take you more than 40 hours for the private pilot. To summarize, we've talked about our 10 hours of any flight time, which means flight training, flight, any kind of legally logged flight time. And we've talked about our 10 hours of solo, where if designed properly, all of your sport pilot solo hours can count towards private. And finally, we've talked about your 20 hours, which is actually 17 hours of dual, and how that can be applied towards your private pilot certificate. So there we go. Hopefully that'll help you understand how many sport pilot hours will count towards your private.